Hi, Zalna here, and welcome back to my vlog where I talk about how you can raise your issue in the legislative and policy making process. This is part 3 in a series on land expropriation without compensation. In part 1, I briefly spoke about the challenges related to land distribution and what the Constitution said about expropriation of property. In part 2, I briefly spoke about the Expropriation Bill, where it is, and the Expropriation of Land Act of 1975. I also mentioned the Property Valuation Act. I also raised some of the trends that was highlighted in the public hearings conducted throughout the country by the Constitutional Review Committee. In part 2, I mentioned that in addition to conducting public hearings, the Constitutional Review Committee also received an enormous amount of written submissions. The committee identified about 30 stakeholders to present to it orally. These briefings and presentations took place last week. Some of the stakeholders raised proposals, whilst others raised concerns. So what I'm going to do below now is to just highlight some of the issues raised by some of the stakeholders. It doesn't include all of these stakeholders. The Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies Plus was of the view that Section 25 makes provision for expropriation without compensation, if it is just and equitable to do so. However, they said that if it's not just and equitable to pay zero compensation, then compensation should be paid. It was highlighted that the purpose of the property clause was therefore to strengthen the right of the propertyless by creating a right of access to land on an equitable basis. Section 25 is therefore not an absolute right to property. It is more, the purpose of Section 25, they argue, was to create a different relationship between the land and the landless. They further argued that Section 25 places a positive obligation on the state to provide suitable land and housing to the homeless. It was highlighted that the purpose of the property clause was therefore, and I read, to strengthen the right of the propertyless by creating a right of access to land on an equitable basis. Is therefore not an absolute right to property, but rather aims to create a transformed property relationship between the landed and landless and between owners and tenants. The question as to when the state should expropriate property without compensation, they argued or proposed, should be done on a case-by-case basis. One of the proposals they made was that there needs to be a new compensation regime, one that is flexible and based on the principles of just and equitable. It was suggested that no compensation could be paid in cases where there were inner city buildings with absentee landlords, informal settlements, labor tenants, and this is where labor tenants have been living on farms for generations. And the other suggestion was publicly owned land and land that is donated. Congress of South African Trade Unions, COSATU, emphasized its disappointment with government's failure to implement land reform. They further stressed that the failure of land reform was not due to the Constitution, and that the Constitution should only be amended if it's absolutely necessary to do that. It further proposed that expropriation without compensation could take place for land that has been neglected, abandoned, land owned by absentee landlords, as well as state-owned land and land that has been donated. The Agricultural Business Chamber raised concerns around the fact that the current total farm debt is 197 billion, and expropriation without compensation poses a risk to collateral, which ultimately will increase the risk of lending to everyone in the agricultural sector. The Hope of Glory Tabernacle pointed out that before amending Section 25 of the Constitution, there needs to be a determination as to which land would be expropriated without compensation. A concern from the church was that most residential housing are mortgaged, and the question they raised was if these properties are going to be expropriated without compensation, who was going to pay these mortgage bonds? Another issue that they raised, or a concern that they emphasized, was that the government should not perpetuate the evils of the apartheid government, which was to take land from legal owners without paying for it. It is becoming overwhelmingly clear that the Constitution makes provision for expropriation without compensation. Examples that was raised during the public hearings was that water is a national resource. Another example was the Minerals and Petroleum Resources Development Act. The Act makes provision for the state to become the custodian of mineral rights, and there was no compensation paid in this case. The Constitutional Review Committee is now tasked with looking at the issues of expropriation and compensation and whether or not to amend the Constitution. The question is, will they amend the Constitution? It seems at this stage that there will be a constitutional amendment for a clarity-seeking clause on compensation. It's also clear that there will need to be a white paper on compensation. So these are the things the committee will have to look at. For more information, or if you wish to contact me, please visit my website at www.selnajansenconsultancy.co.za.